Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time today. It's really an honor to speak with both of you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion to put some answers to this question about wheat and gluten sensitivity and some of the confusion that's out there right now. And perhaps we can start by an overview of I'll ask Dr. Bland. Dr. Bland, I know that there are many different components to wheat. And is it that if someone has a sensitivity to the proteins of wheat, the glutens of wheat, and they have the genetic vulnerability and develop celiac disease, we're very clear about that. But is that the only component of wheat that may be a problem for people? Is the gluten, the protein components?
Yeah, Dr. O'Brien, I think this is an extraordinarily important, interesting, and still evolving topic that has significant implication on the health of people throughout the world. So I think that we're addressing something that is certainly worthwhile of very deep debate, understanding, and discovery. You know, Jacob Bronowski in his book, The Ascent of Man, talked about the remarkable, improbable event that occurred probably several 100,000 years ago when a wild grass co-hybridized with a wild wheat. And at that point, we would probably say that grains were not going to ever be a major part of human diet because they were very small plants, not very robust. The grains were dispersed by the wind, and you could never really collect them together to make a pile that we called a reserve from which food could be derived. But when that event occurred, you got this short stalk kind of wheat connected to the grain genome, and it produced the ability for the cultivation of this particular material, which was in the Great Triangle of Egypt, where some of these grains were first able to be cultivated. And from that, then one would able to take the threshed grain on these that was tied tightly to the stalk and hit it on the ground and form a pile that we call the reserve of wheat, or the reserve of grain, from which you could mill it and ultimately make bread and have it as part of a normal diet. So it was a very labor-intensive job, but it was really derived out of this improbable genetic hybridization of a wheat with a grass, basically. And that really became the staple of what we call ancient grains for the complex carbohydrate component of the diet for some period of time in these great walled cities of early humans. What's happened over time, however, is as you've so eloquently described to your listeners, is that we've modified these grains significantly through genetic hybridization. And through hybridization, the original characteristics of these wild ancient grains have been modified to suit certain things that are important for high yield production within the food industry. So greater yields, greater take-up of fertilizer, pest resistance, greater resistance to various kinds of biocides, and then certain characteristics in the baking industry, the rheological properties that relate to making dough that could be conveniently made into bread and other products. And so we engineered basically through genetic hybridization these ancient grains into being more and more commercial products that would be higher yield and have characteristics that were better for the baking industry. And in so doing, it obviously led to the modification of some of the constituents, the proteins, that were originally in the ancient grains. It wasn't that they produced necessarily toxic substances, it just modified the amino acid sequences in some of these proteins to create new variants of these proteins. And I think the question that we're all raising right now, which I know has been on your leadership education front burner for some time, is as we've modified these, did it ultimately produce certain amino acid sequences in these grains to which the human immune system hasn't been able to adapt quickly enough and finds them as foreigners? And if so, then produces a reaction that the body should produce in the presence of a foreign substance, and that is an immune response. And I think that's the state where we are right now, is to really try to understand what related effect these food technology improvements have had on the reaction of our immune system, which can't maybe modify itself as quickly as the grains can be hybridized, and produce then a series of what we consider untoward events like non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So
well,
that's kind of how I see it historically.
That's a brilliant historical perspective to help all of us have an overview of what's happened to the product that currently is being put on our table and where did it come from. And as our good friend Dr. Mark Houston has coined so well, our bodies have a limited number of responses to an unlimited number of insults. And so when we take in a food that we're sensitive to, is it that our bodies consider this to be an invader, almost like a parasite, and so that the reactions are very similar when our immune system in the intestines recognizes that food coming in as a foreigner?
Well, I think that's a really incredibly important question that relates to all sorts of substances. Food ingredients are part of that, but all these environmental substances that we're now exposed to from the industrialization of society. You know, it's very interesting to me. We call these immune response diseases, like the autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or systemic lupus erythematosus or multiple sclerosis or celiac disease. We call them genetically linked diseases, as if somehow people have imperfect immune systems by some genetic mistake. But it's very possible that these are not genetic mistakes at all. These are genetic strengths that those people carry in their genes for a specific kind of environment that their ancestors may have lived in which those reactions to their environment were actually very important to allow their ancestors to survive against some hostile factor like a bug, a virus, or something that might have killed everybody else if they didn't have that characteristic. The problem is that today these genetic strengths that might have been very useful for us for protection in our ancestral history today might be turning and doing innocent bystander reaction on our own body by overreacting to things that we have put into our environment and our foods that were considered okay, but they're actually not okay to these highly vigilant immune systems that then react as they should by fighting back against what they perceive as a foreigner. And so the yellow canaries of our society appear as these people that are the first ones to be getting these disorders, like non-celiac gluten sensitivity, because their immune systems were heightened to be more sensitive to those kinds of exposures. So I think we often label people as being like imperfect because they have these, quote, diseases, but maybe their immune systems are actually overly perfect and they're overly responding to foreigners.
Well, I think that that's exactly, and please excuse me for speaking for the organization that you and Deanna have set up, but Deanna, let me ask you, isn't that the purpose of the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute, is for us to understand what our own bodies are designed to take in as nutrient, and how foods that nowadays have been modified, that our bodies may see them as more of a foreigner and more of a threat, and so that our immune systems are acting as they should to protect us from that threat?
Yes, I would agree. I think what Dr. Bland said makes complete sense. It's such a great lineage to see how grains have evolved and how our bodies have evolved. And I think one of the points in nutrigenomics that we have to pay attention to is epigenetics. So how is our genome changing based on those environmental changes? So Dr. Bland talked about the protein changes, and I would also say that as a result of changing protein, we probably have changed the saccharide content of the grain. We probably have changed the phytochemical content of the grain. So it's not just I think in nutrition we tend to just focus on one thing, but I think that the whole grain itself and all of its constituents are changing. And that is interfacing with our personalized needs, as you're saying, Tom. So, yes. And one thing that I would like for Dr. Bland to talk about a little bit, because it does bring to mind one of his functional medicine updates in which he interviewed Dr. Christina Harris, talking, and she's a pathologist, and what her observation was that potentially what we're looking at with gluten is that it's not just, the sensitivity is not just the gluten in the grain, but perhaps there are these other long-chain saccharides that people aren't digesting well, and we're seeing the whole FODMAPs approach being very successful for many people. So is it just the protein, or is it the whole complex of food and how it's changing and how our bodies are changing? And back to the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute, that really is what the entity is about, is trying to find where the individual can meet their best needs.
Prior to answering the question, Dr. Bland, Deanna, may I ask you, for our listening audience, what are saccharides and what are phytonutrients and what are FODMAPs?
Oh, very good. Okay, so saccharides is just a very generic biochemical name to denote sugars, long-chain sugars. So attached to a lot of these proteins in the grains, you have these long sugar molecules of varying sizes. Just like protein can come in different sizes, different strands of amino acids put together. Same thing with carbohydrates. So saccharides refers to carbohydrates. Phytochemicals, if you take apart the word, phyto meaning plant-based, chemical or a compound in the plant. So it's been estimated that there are 5,000 to 10,000 of these different phytonutrients or phytochemicals in our food supply. So that's what I'm speaking to, are all of the, I would call them the nutritional underdogs. They're not the macronutrients that give us calories. They're the small constituents that are having great impact at the cell signaling level. So they could be having changes in our gut.
And we've all heard of things such as resveratrol in red wine, and that's why red wine's supposed to be good for us, and the sulforaphanes in broccoli, and why broccoli is supposed to be good for us, because these phytochemicals are the mini molecules that help our bodies be stronger and deal with the environment that we're exposed to.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. And so, Dr. Bland, the International Celiac Symposium occurs every 2 years. And in 2011 in Oslo, they came up with the realization that we really need to look at more than just celiac disease. And for clinicians like myself, the response was, "You think?" Yes, we do. But they finally came around. You know, the scientists need lots of data, lots of science behind them before they'll kind of step out on a ledge with new understandings on a topic. And they came up with a classification system for gluten-related disorders. And I think that's what Deanna is referring to here. And so can you talk a little about the different aspects of how wheat, rye, and barley may be a problem for people?
Yeah, I think the two of you are hitting into really the core of this whole extraordinary revolution in thinking and understanding that we are now going through as it pertains to the role that the present food technology can have on immunological responses that cut across these different families of inflammatory autoimmune diseases. You know, I was as I was listening to Deanna speak, and by the way, that was a brilliant description, Deanna, of saccharides. I thought that was really very, very user-friendly. Congratulations, because it's a pretty complex topic. But one of the recent papers that appeared just within the last couple of weeks, actually in the February 25th issue of Nature magazine, is a very interesting article by the lead authors are Chasning and Gowitz, who were talking about the role that emulsifiers in food are found to have on the production of inflammatory bowel disease. And they have this animal model that they have done to demonstrate that. And they indicate that the problem child in the emulsifiers that's acting in this inflammatory way in the gut is a chemical called carboxymethylcellulose. And that is a carbohydrate derivative, and we think of cellulose, that's like the plant cell wall carbohydrates that we would normally think of as being kind of neutral. The body just is a fiber, it wouldn't do anything. But this particularly modified fiber that is used as emulsifying agent in many foods, as an allowed ingredient, can create a reaction to the immune system in some immunologically sensitive animals to that particular substance, and now that saccharide, that modified saccharide, carboxymethylcellulose, produces an inflammatory condition that could be considered inflammatory bowel disease. So I think that we have to be very cautious what we call friends and what we call foes, because they can be different from person to person based upon their immunology. And I think that the non-celiac gluten sensitivity story, as Deanna is saying, is more than just gluten itself. It is the complex of gluten and the family of proteins that are associated in that gluten family with all these other modifications that have occurred in our foods as a consequence of genetic hybridization. And I think that this is a little bit of a Monte Carlo game, right? You've got multiple things going on, and you've got multiple different types of immune systems in different people, and now we do the wild card, we throw the dice out there, and we see what comes up as winners and losers, and there are more and more dice that are coming up as losers, meaning inflammatory disorders, because we have more and more funny business going on in our food that interacts with a very diverse immune system that may already be somewhat under siege from exposure to chemicals and poor quality diets and the stress and various factors that already make our immune system hypersensitized. So I think it's a complex story, but it's a real story when it comes down to the individual person who suddenly seems to get sensitive to everything they're eating, and they've got all sorts of symptoms they never had before, and it's not just all in their mind. It's a real organic problem.
Well, that's very well said, and as we've spoken before, there are a number of papers that talk about why this increase in recognition of wheat as a problem, and where is it coming from, and a component of that is what's referred to as a loss of oral tolerance. Now, the three of us know that one well, but for our listening audience, it means there are so many threats that are coming to us on a daily basis, so many from different avenues, from the emulsifiers in food, from the ingredients in our beverages, and sometimes the chemicals in water, and our body has a limited number of options of response to an unlimited number of insults. So if we see wheat as for some people, it's a minor insult. The immune system says, oh, that's an annoyance, but it's not a big problem. But with all of the other threats that come in on a daily basis, our world becomes more toxic. The threshold of tolerability to our immune system, it becomes hypervigilant. It's like a guard that's standing guard for 24-hour shifts, and at the end of that 24-hour shift, and there's been a lot of action during that time, he may be a little response happy and just respond too quickly. And that's what's being referred to as a loss of oral tolerance, and that certainly is one of the mechanisms of why there is this increase in recognition of problems with gluten. Now, the components of wheat, Dr. Bland, I'd like to ask you on this one, and Deanna, if you have a thought on it also. We know that the components of wheat, different components can be a problem for people. It may be the protein gluten. It may be that family of carbohydrates called FODMAPs. It may be the lectins called wheat germ agglutinins. It may be the oils. It may be the amylase trypsin inhibitors, which is the category that our friend Dr. Bill Davis wrote about in his book Wheat Belly, and why some people lose weight so well. It's the wheat amylase trypsin inhibitors, a component of wheat that may be the problem for some people. Have you seen anything as to one component being more frequent than the others for sensitivity, or are we thinking these days that it could be any component for anyone who's developing a loss of oral tolerance?
Well, thank you. You're asking really tough questions that I think are right at the head of the class with regard to areas that we want to have more knowledge. My response to that goes back to a book I just recently read that is maybe a little technical for the average reader, but if those want to dig in a little deeper, might be a good read. It was a book just published last year by Daniel Davis, entitled The Compatibility Gene. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this book. The subtitle of the book is How Our Bodies Fight Disease, Attract Others, and Defend Ourselves. And it really talks about these so-called histocompatibility locus antigens in our lymphocyte antigen system, the defensive system that's carried in our genes that is able to differentiate friends from foe, and why this system is getting confused these days, and why we're seeing more and more things that used to be considered friendly, like our own tissues, suddenly become recognized as foe, like hostile invaders, and so we start reacting to them ourselves. And I think this book really does a nice job in helping us to understand the complexity of the interrelationship of our body's immune vigilance system that you're talking about, and the relationship it shares with things like our gut microbiota, this complex array of all these critters that live in our intestinal tract, which, you know, is the second largest organ in our body, only to that of the skin, and some like 2 to 3 pounds of living bacteria that have their own personality. And our immune system has to kind of introduce those bacteria to us, the ones that are friendly as friendly, and then the ones that are not so friendly, it has to respond to them and kill them before they take over us. So there's one portion where one place where our body's immune system has an intimate relationship with our non-cells, our bacterial cells, which, by the way, those bacterial cells that live in our intestinal tract are fed by the same thing that we're fed by, because they get the food coming down our intestinal tract, and so they can alter their composition as a consequence of our diet. So eating funny things can produce funny bacteria, which puts a stress on our immune system. So there's one place where people can get reactions to food, even though it's not directly to the food. It's the effect of the food on the bacteria, which then have an effect on our immune system. So this topic you're raising has much complexity associated with it, and what we often see is this complexity is triggered in an inflammatory way by diets that seem to be rich in gluten proteins. So the question is gluten the marker, or is it the cause? In other words, is it the introducer of dietary changes that bring these funny things to our bodies that our immune system, our HLA antibodies are now responding to, or is it in and itself the major cause? And I would say yes to both questions. In some people, it is the major cause. In other people, it's the marker of other things that come along with a gluten-rich diet that are reacting to our immune system and producing this. The only thing one can see clinically, and you know this from thousands of examples you've seen in your experience clinically, is that by elimination of gluten and all the things that come along with it in a highly processed, modified, industrialized diet, people will get better. And often you don't know exactly where in their immune system you push the right button to create the right outcome, but they think clearer, they don't have pain, their joints are free of swelling, they don't have alternating constipation and diarrhea, they don't have a sense of feeling drugged and having a foggy brain syndrome. So all of these things somehow are real. Sometimes we just don't know the exact causative agent that occurs as it pertains to the cleaning up of the diet.
Yes. Yes. And Deanna, in your clinical experience and in your work in teaching doctors, you have lots of discussions off stage. What are you finding in terms of the components of wheat? Are clinicians out there recognizing that gluten sensitivity goes beyond celiac disease, that they find that non-celiac patients will have benefit, some of them from eliminating wheat? Is this a common theme out there? Would you say that it's the majority of doctors that you talk to that are experiencing that, or a minority? What's the feel for you in that?
You know, I would say it depends on the audience, quite honestly. I mean, it's a very good question, because when I'm talking with functional medicine-based docs and integrative medicine practitioners who see the broader context of health, there's greater receptivity, and they see that clinically. When we talk to more of the mainstream gastroenterologists or even internal medicine doctors, I don't see that same receptivity, and there is this poo-pooing of, you know, this gluten fad. That's where you start to hear it, right? Because they hear it from their patients. They're not sure how to respond. I'd also like to respond, Tom, to your question about, you know, what is it in those foods, right? And Dr. Bland definitely showed us and took us down the path of showing us that it's probably the whole food. We don't know what it is. It could be the gluten. It can be the food as it's presented in a processed food product. I think as a nutritionist, one of the things that we do is we isolate and slice and dice the food down to try to figure out what it is, but really we don't eat nutrients, we eat food. right? And so what I have seen clinically is that when people stop eating certain foods, especially those that contain, they happen to contain gluten, so a lot of the processed carbohydrate-containing foods, what we see is a remediation, an improvement of their symptoms. So I think, back to my friend Dr. Alejandro Younger, he always says you cannot argue with clinical success. You know, you don't have to have volumes of science in order to justify what you're seeing clinically. If it works, it works. So, and that's what I have seen for some patients, is that when they start cleaning up their diet, when they become less stressed, when they start living a life that benefits their genes, they seem to fall into this zone of optimal health and feeling a lot better.
Well, that's a beautiful lead-in to the question I'd like to ask of Dr. Bland. Dr. Bland, what is the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute? And is that something that our listeners would be interested in?
Well, thanks, Tom. What we're trying to do in the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute is be a consolidator of this revolution in understanding that I think we are going through as a culture as to how our genes interact with our lifestyles and our environment to create health and disease. And this is truly a major shift in understanding as to how variable different people's responses are to the same environment. So the food of one can be the poison of another is what we're talking about here. So the question really is not what is a good diet. The question is, what is the right lifestyle for an individual to produce optimal century-long good health so that they can maximize their genetic potential and compress disease and be fully functional throughout the whole course of their biologically given life expectancy. And I think we are now, for the first time, getting the tools in medicine and biological sciences to actually be able to ask that question using various things like genomic tests and various types of new biomarker evaluations to actually understand on a more personalized level what it is that requires for an individual to maximize their health, not just prevent disease. That's kind of a negative connotation, like always, oh my word, I hope I don't get disease. The real question is, how do we live fully functional? How do we really, because if we are resilient, we don't worry about disease. I mean, we keep our disease genes at bay, and we have our good health genes, our vibrant, what I would call bliss genes being exposed and expressed, and that's really the question that the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute is all about. How do we leverage this extraordinary amount of new information that's coming out to apply it in an effective way to the individual so that they're not worried about disease. What they're really focusing on is being a fully functional, capable, healthy individual. And so our website, Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute website, which is PLMI or PLMinstitute.org, is kind of a clearinghouse for this kind of information. We've got interviews and blog spheres and articles and discussions to help people understand what resources are available to really start activating and actualizing some of these opportunities that occur with these extraordinary discoveries that are happening right now.
So I would say to all of our listening audience, there's no one answer, and what you'll find at PL Institute, is that right? The website?
PLMinstitute.org.
PLMinstitute.org is you're going to find cutting-edge information on this topic. And then you're going to find cutting-edge information on this topic. And then you're going to find cutting-edge information on this topic so that you start being exposed and you start thinking about, oh, that's why green vegetables are good for me. Or, oh, that's why tomatoes can be good for me. And for some people, they're exceptionally good for them. And for others, they're a little bit good for them. But that's as I understand, the goal of the PLM Institute is to give the general public this cutting-edge information in a presentation style that's easy to go for. So I really want to give a plug here to everyone who's watching this to go check out the website and have an OMG moment when you see when you see what's there for you. Now there's a topic I want to go to. It's really important to me because it quite honestly gets me angry that tens of thousands of people are being misled by the supermarket magazines and newspaper articles that say non-celiac gluten sensitivity is a fad. And so we have these people out there who recognize you can't argue with celiac disease. If you've got celiac disease, that's an autoimmune disease. It's not difficult to diagnose. But some of these people are saying if you don't have celiac disease, it's a fad. And I want to show a mechanism that occurred for our listening audience. And this was in the journal Gastroenterology in May of 2013. And the title of the article, I'm going to read the title to you so that you have a sense of this. No effects of gluten in patients with self-reported non-celiac gluten sensitivity after dietary reduction of fermentable, poorly absorbed short-chain carbohydrates. Those are the FODMAPs. So what we had was a blogger in English article and wrote a blog on it saying, see, the science says there's no effects of gluten. Gluten doesn't have an effect on people. And he wrote a sensational article, and I think he called them not wimps, but it was a word like wimps for anyone who said they're sensitive to gluten and they don't have celiac disease. Well, a writer saw that blog site and wrote an article in the London Times. And then another writer wrote an article in the Global News. And then it crossed the ocean and went to Forbes magazine. And then it went to the New York Times. And then it went to the Wall Street Journal. All of these writers writing about science says there's no such thing as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. That's not what they were saying at all. That what these authors in Australia were trying to do was to see if there are other components of wheat besides the proteins gluten that may be a problem. As a matter of fact, in the 250 people that applied to be in the study, 39% of them had elevated antibodies to the gluten proteins, and they were not allowed in the study. So that the authors were trying to see, for those people that don't have the gluten protein as a sensitivity, are there other components of wheat? And what they found was, yes, you bet. Those carbohydrates can be a real problem for some people. And they even said in the research article, it seems that these carbohydrates called FODMAPs appear to contribute to more of the GI complaints, the bloating and the gas, and that the gluten proteins appear to impact on the loss of well-being, which means, and that was their language, outside of the intestines. You just don't feel good. Maybe it's your joints, maybe it's a foggy brain, maybe it's somewhere else. But they made the title, No Effects of Gluten in Patients with Self-Reported Non-Celiac Gluten Sensitivity. One more point. In their study, after they took out the people that had elevated antibodies to gluten, they still had 8% of the participants in the study that had a gluten effect. And they missed them in the screening, but they had a gluten effect. So my thought is the title of the study should have been Minimal Effects or Minor Effects of Gluten in Patients with Self-Reported Non-Celiac Gluten Sensitivity, because the paper showed that 8% of those people did have gluten effects. The same research group came out 8 months later with a paper showing that non-celiac gluten sensitivity may cause depression in a large percentage of people that have this sensitivity to the protein. So they were acknowledging that for some people the protein's a problem. Well, but we had this sensationalism because people like reading negative stuff, and you call somebody a wimp and they'll love to read about it, and it makes good press. But this year, there have been a number of studies that have come out that have really put the nail in the coffin. Of course, there is non-celiac gluten sensitivity for some people. Yes, the protein component is a problem for some people. For some, it's the carbohydrates. For some, it's the wheat amylase trypsin inhibitors. For some, it's the lectins. But it's the plant, wheat, that is the problem for a fairly respectable percentage of people. And it's not just celiac disease. So here's a couple of the studies that have just come out. Here's one, characterization of adults with a self-diagnosis of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This just came out in November of 2014. It's the same group that wrote the paper, No Effects of Gluten in patients with self-reported non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Now the paper they write is characterization of adults with a self-diagnosis. And in their conclusion, they say just over 1 in 4 respondents self-reporting as non-celiac gluten sensitivity fulfill the criteria for its diagnosis, meaning 25% of the people that thought they had gluten sensitivity actually did have gluten sensitivity. The others, they had problems with other components of wheat. It was the FODMAPs or was some other component, but only 1 out of 4 who thought it was the gluten, it actually was the gluten. But that validates that some people have a problem with the gluten protein. The next one that is yet to be published has just been accepted by the journal Gastroenterology and will come out in perhaps April or May. I don't know the date, but it was accepted in December, is by our friend Dr. Alessio Fasano, who has been the main mover of information for all of us about impacts of gluten on the intestines. And we all appreciate Dr. Fasano's work. He actually won the Linus Pauling Award from the Institute for Functional Medicine because his work is so groundbreaking. And this paper is entitled Non-Celiac Gluten Sensitivity. That's just the name of the paper. And not only is Dr. Fasano on it, but Dr. Schupan, Detlef Schupan, who is a gastroenterologist at Harvard and world famous in the world of celiac disease. They co-authored the paper with Anna Sapone and Victor Zavalos, the 4 of them. And here's a sentence from the conclusion of their paper. Although there clearly is a fad component to the popularity of the gluten-free diet, there is also indisputable and increasing evidence of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So what our scientists are beginning to tell us is that, yes, there is this thing called NCGS. We think that a lot of people have been pooled in that category, and now we're finding, as Dr. Bland has said, that there's other components of wheat that may be the problem, and it's not the protein, gluten. It may be the carbohydrates or the amylase trypsin inhibitors or the lectins. There's other components, but it's the plant itself. And that if people have a sensitivity to the plant, it's worth addressing and trying it out to see, am I better when I go on a gluten-free diet? Dr. Bland, is there anything that you would like to add to that?
Well, Tom, I think you did a superb job of bringing us up to speed with regard to where the controversy, the discussion in the current medical literature resides. This a little bit to me, and maybe I've been around in this field too long, nearly 40 years now, or actually probably a little more than 40 years, because I've been through many different periods of what are considered fads that go through the pendulum swinging within this field of nutrition. And some of this ultimately degenerates to debating the number of angels on the head of a pin. You know, it's really a bunch of people who I don't know, have certain axe to grind, and they're gonna wrestle an argument way beyond where its useful application occurs, just to kind of win some technicality in the sphere of their influence. And I think that's a little bit of what's going on right now in this area of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, because, as we say, the real proof of the pudding, or the real outcome, is how people feel, how they respond, why they get sick, and how they get better. That's the real key. And it reminds me a little bit, if I could go back and use an analogy, to the Dr. Feingold situation that some of you might remember. Benjamin Feingold, pediatrician, who made these observations in children that seems that colorants and various types of flavorings that were being put in kids' foods that were all, you know, highly colored processed foods and highly sweet, were producing behavior difficulties. And that became, quote, a fad. And he was discredited and debunked by all sorts of experts in the field of immunology and pediatrics, and, you know, his life was pretty rough. I knew him personally, and he was a very dedicated guy that was just making observations that he had seen in his patients and trying to bring it to people's attention. And you had all these purported experts that were going in and analyzing this, again, like angels on the head of a pin. And as we look now today, some 30 years later, much of what Ben Feingold, in fact, the majority of what he was talking about, has been proven correct, that there are sensitivities that certain immunologically unique individuals have to the things that were used as common coloring agents, orange and red colorings and other coloring agents, as well as flavoring agents, to which children's immune systems were sensitive and were producing neurochemical responses that we call behavior difficulties. So now it's been proven correct, but I can tell you during the time of Dr. Feingold's popularity, it was all said it's a fad, it was debunked, everyone wanted to make their own axe to grind, and I think that's a little bit of what we're seeing here today with this celiac suggestion, because everyone wants to be known as the expert that has the truth. And the bottom line is, as you've said, dietary modification for many of these people, getting these fructooligosaccharides out of their diet, getting those foods that contain gluten and hybridized grains out of their diet, makes a huge difference in their clinical outcome. And that's the bottom line, reducing the burden of unnecessary disease. And in the absence of that, we're just wasting our time and energy in an intellectual debate that doesn't carry forward the health of our society.
Well, that's really brilliant, Jeff, and thank you for bringing up Dr. Feingold. And you're absolutely right. Pioneers sometimes who just observe and they want to share the information, they can be jumped upon, and that certainly is an example, and that's happening now with NCGS quite a bit. And I love the visual. I'm thinking angels on the head of a pin. All right, that's a unique visual. Deanna, is there something that you would like to add to that?
Oh, goodness. I don't know if I can. I mean, both of you have said it so eloquently. I would say, Tom, to stay on this path, to continue to educate people, and you're really helping people to affect a lot of change in their lives, and that's most important. Oh. So I think it's back to what Dr. Bland was saying. We're going to try out many different dietary approaches. We have to find which one works for us. So I think the more information that we get out there about different constituents in our foods, allowing people to assess what makes them feel good, because again, that is the personalized lifestyle medicine approach, and then we'll find our way to optimal health.
Yes.
So it's been great.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little about your website and your emphasis on food? Sure.
My emphasis is on detoxification and phytonutrients, and so through my website.
Excuse me, what does detoxification mean? For some of our people, they don't know.
Yes, I'm glad that you asked that question. So detoxification to me means removing any barriers to our health, any toxins. So that could be physical toxins, all of the environmental chemicals in the environment. Could also mean mental toxins, negative thoughts. It could be emotions that kind of weigh us down. It could be toxic relationships. It could be toxic jobs. So there are many barriers that we might have to our vitality, and I would consider those toxins. So detoxification in the classic sense has always been referred to nutritionally. In the way that I see it is in a much more a broad spectrum approach, if you will. So that's how I define detoxification.
Thank you. And your website?
The website is foodandspirit.com. So we have a professional program, a certification program, where people can learn about a physiological and psychological approach to toxins and to working with patients. And then people that want to go through our programs, again, we encompass both of those areas, physiology, psychology. We even look at personality, because there's great science now to suggest that there are many different personality and psychological types that correspond to disease. So we bring it all in, which is why I like to call it full spectrum, and I focus on the colors.
Beautifully, by the way. It's just lovely. Your site, I love going there just to look at the colors and your design.
Thank you.
So yesterday, someone asked me, how is it possible that food selections might have an impact on their hay fever? That when the season comes and there's pollen in the air, they always have terrible reactions, and they had heard that food might make a difference. And I want to give this example because it relates directly to what you're talking about, Deanna, and your big picture overview, and that is that if you have a glass of water and you pour more water in the glass and it keeps coming up, eventually it overflows. But you keep pouring water, and that's the exposures we have. So if you have a sensitivity to foods, and that's a insult to your body, your glass is pretty full. And then here comes the pollen in the air, and it takes your immune system over the edge. So if you reduce the amount of the toxic or allergenic foods in your diet, the glass goes down. Now you're exposed to the pollen, and your reactions may go down dramatically just by changing your diet, and you need much less medication for hay fever. So that's just a visual for our listening audience. And Deanna, as I understand where you've taken it, you've gone to the whole world of detoxification as anything that comes at us.
Yeah.
Socially, biochemically, emotionally, spiritually. And I can say from personal experience, you do it so well that it's just a great tool for people to look to and to use, consider using. So
Well,
thank you for that.
Thank you. And you know, it's so interesting that we use the same metaphor. I love the cup metaphor as a representative of our body, right? It's a symbol of what we're taking in. So I just want to leave the listeners with 3 questions. And these are the 3 that I continually have my patients ask themselves and people going through our programs. The first one is, what should we be avoiding? This is where we do talk about gluten or things in our environment. The second question is, what nourishes us? So it's not only, like what Dr. Bland was saying, it's not just the negative of what do we avoid, but what do we bring in that's positive, that is nourishing and supporting? And then the third question is, what makes us thrive? If we can be in our utopia and in our sparkly environment of where we have all of our wishes come true, what would that look like? So to have us answer those questions, even journal on them, you know, is it gluten what we need to avoid? If we avoid gluten, what nourishes us? What do we bring in to replace that gluten? And then what phytonutrients and what foods and what situations really help us to thrive and be our fullest potential? So hopefully that's helpful, especially as we're talking about detoxification.
Well, thank you so much. That's very helpful, very, very helpful. And Dr. Bland, any last thoughts or messages that you'd like to give to our audience?
Well, Tom, thanks. I think this has been extraordinarily informative and enlightening for me to work through this with you and Deanna both. It's talk about 2 resident experts. Really been fun. I think I'd like to just pass on one closing thought, and that is often we feel imperiled by all these things in the outside world as if we have no recourse. You know, we didn't kind of fill out an application card. We just kind of got born into this time, and we have to deal with all these pressures on our body that make us sick. But the other side of the coin is that we have an extraordinary resilience, and that's one of the things that I really liked when I read the book by Daniel Davis that talks about the compatibility genes and how they're really there to protect us against all sorts of things that if we didn't have those genes in our genome, we would be in deep trouble every day because we're exposed to all sorts of less than a perfect environment, and bugs are out there and all sorts of stuff is trying to take us over, but our bodies are pretty darn resilient. And in fact, I just finished reading and probably you're familiar with this, in the New England Journal of Medicine, arguably considered one of the top medical journals in the world, in the February 26th issue of 2015, is this a very interesting editorial and article that talks about preventing peanut allergy in children. And they're saying that, you know, maybe we've been doing the wrong thing by avoiding all these things in children's diets, because maybe we need to immunize them by exposing them to low amounts of these things so that their immune system becomes used to them and they can develop a tolerance, you know, this oral tolerance you talked about. And so maybe we try to make things too clean as parents, and we don't allow the kids to get into the dirt and play around and be exposed to things, and to get their resilience really up and fully activated so that they can defend themselves throughout the course of their life with a world that's never going to be perfect. And I think these resilience factors we have by doing the right things, as Dr. Minich was saying, you know, giving ourselves the right things to support our resilience, while we're also taking away those things that are really trying to steal from us our resilience. That's a two-edged sword. I think it needs to both be, because I think a lot of our attention is just taking away stuff and not recognizing by adding back the right stuff. We're really tough as an animal. We've survived as a consequence of our ability of our immune system to become resilient given the right opportunity. So that would be my kind of closing thought.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And it's so consistent with Deanna's also about, and you talk of happy genes, and Deanna talks about what nourishes you and keeping the bigger picture in mind. It's overwhelming. for people that don't study medicine and haven't spent their whole life studying healthcare. It's overwhelming now with all of the information that's out there. And you want to always go to the sources that you feel comfortable with and not put a lot of credence into the supermarket articles. You know, places like Dr. Minich's site, foodandspirit.com, and Dr. Bland's Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute. These are, and my site, theDr.com. These are places where you're going to get the information that you can count on as accurate, that it's all science-based and interpreted in language that's everyday. It is overwhelming, and that's something I think that many of our doctors forget to tell the patients, is that just take this a step at a time. This can be so overwhelming to change your lifestyle a little bit at a time, and you're going to make it. And I'd like to end by thanking Dr. Deanna Minich and Dr. Jeffrey Bland, the godfather of functional medicine and my mentor. Thank you so much for being here today and taking your time to do this. And I'm going to end with a quote that just tickles me. It always tickles me. There was this fella in Chicago. His name was Studs Terkel. And he was a character. He had a fedora. He was a writer for one of the Chicago papers and had a cigar all the time. And when he would be leaving from a group of friends, as he's walking out the door, he'd turn around and he would say, "Take it easy, but take it." So take it a step at a time. Don't get overwhelmed. Just take as much information as you can at one time, such as this thing about gluten sensitivity. It's not a fad. It's for real. Take this information one step at a time and continue taking it, and your health will improve and the health of your children. And with that, I would say thank you very much, Jeff and Deanna, and thank you all for listening.